Dear friends in Christ, my name is Dr. Ken Bailey. I'm a Presbyterian clergyman with close ties to both the Roman Catholic and to the Episcopal Church, and I have taught New Testament in seminaries and institutes across the Middle East, in Egypt and in Lebanon, and in Jerusalem and in Cyprus for 40 years, and am currently a writer and lecturer in New Testament studies in this country and around the world. It has come to my attention that there are many people who have been exposed to the recent novel entitled The Da Vinci Code that are in need of some understanding as to the nature of the Gospels and how they came together, and of the selection of the documents for our New Testament. This is the subject of our lecture today. Dear Christian friends, I would like to take this opportunity to chat with you briefly about what I've called historical reality versus murder mystery mythology, or where our Gospels came from, and the new novel, The Da Vinci Code. As we look into this, first of all, when I read that novel, friends asked that I should do so. A number of ideas just sort of flit through my mind by the time I got done. One was, I remembered Theodore Beza, a Swiss theologian of the 16th century, who said that the Bible is an anvil that has broken many hammers. Across the centuries, many hammers have banged away at it, and they've all broken, and the anvil is still there. And this is true of this occasion as well. Lesslie Newbigin, a famous Scottish theologian who spent most of his life in India, in my presence, talked about the fact that biblical scholarship in the West is cannibalistic. The children, every generation, eat their parents. So there's a tremendous tendency to try and chew up everything that came before us, label everybody as having gone wrong, and start all from scratch. We seem to be constantly in that kind of a syndrome, and unfortunately. Then the tone of the novel, with its sort of bitter, irresponsible anti-Roman Catholic attacks, I found very, very disgusting. It's been my privilege for more than 10 years, to nearly 15 years, to teach Roman Catholic nuns and priests from all over the world, and have learned a great deal from them. And I know something about their church through the life of these dear men and women. And to see this kind of irresponsible attack is really unnecessary and unacceptable. Then fourth, I read recently a brief statement, or not statement, but a brief, just one-page article by a woman, Sarah Wilson, who is a doctoral candidate at Princeton Presbyterian Seminary in New Jersey in systematic theology, and she records the fact that recently she was on an airplane and began chatting with the person next to her, who found out that she was into theology, and they said, well, you know, I'm a rational type person. I like to take things seriously. I like to think things through before I believe them. And she said, that's fine. And then he blurted out and said, I'd really like to get my hands on those scrolls. She said, you mean the Dead Sea Scrolls? No, those were found way back in the 40s. These are the scrolls that they found in 1991. Well, what scrolls are those? Oh, these are the ones that are written in the handwriting of Jesus, and forensic evidence proves that they're from the village where he grew up, and we know that it's in his handwriting. And she said, well, how do you know that? Oh, well, they cross-referenced it. She reflects on this, and reflects on the fact that there sort of is in the human psyche a kind of an inner drive for what she calls the Gnostic heretical itch, a kind of an itch to know that secret little bit of information that's going to make us on the inside and all the rest of these dum-dums on the outside. And we know that they're going wrong, and we know that they're stupid, and we, the ones with this inside knowledge, are the ones that are really on top of this package. That itch is always there. Always somebody's talking about something out there. Special gurus are going to explain it to us, and once we get this knowledge, we're going to have the real thing and everybody else will look stupid and we're going to look smart as can be. That itch is very much functioning in this novel and its foundations as well. And then keep in mind that there is a big difference. This is just to sort of, depending on who you are and where you're coming from, the word apocryphal applies to two collections of literature. One is documents written by the Jews between the Old Testament and the time of the New Testament. Those appear in the Greek Old Testament Bible. They are a part of Scripture for Roman Catholics and for Eastern Orthodox. Protestants, at the time of the Reformation, decided to go with the Hebrew Old Testament rather than the Greek Old Testament, and these documents do not appear in those collections. Then the second is the apocryphal Gospels. These are documents written by Greeks in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, and even later than that, there are apocryphal Gospels written in the 7th and 8th centuries. The last of them that I know of was written in the 15th century. These are post-Christian documents. Most of them are Greek in culture, and they're quite different from this earlier collection. So don't confuse those. We will be talking about the apocryphal Gospels. This has nothing to do with the Apocrypha, which is this collection between the Old and the New Testament. Now, again, general impressions. As I read this book, I began scratching my head and saying, this is really pretty clear evidence of the fact that we live here in Western society in a world in which it's open hunting season on all things Christian. Now, you can imagine, if you would please, someone who tries to write a novel, and the basis of the novel is that the whole Jewish faith is bunk, and that Herod the Great put together the Jewish faith as we now know it to solidify his political position, that the apostles never existed, and the documents we have from them are not authentic, and that there are crazed Jews out there that are trying to kill anybody who will release the documents that prove that Judaism is a whole bunch of nonsense, and that the real Judaism that was there before Herod came along and created the Judaism we now know worshipped a female goddess, and there were sex rites involved in it, and there are secret documents that prove this. Now, you write that, and the Anti-Defamation League is going to attack you, rightly so. There's going to be meetings, and there's going to be complaints, there's going to be statements in government positions. The person who writes this is going to be labeled as anti-Semitic. Solomon Rushdie, about 15 years ago, wrote a novel about the foundations of Islam, which he called the Satanic Verses. Great offense was taken in the Islamic world. The Iranian authorities under Khomeini said anyone who kills this man will pay them $2 million. There is still a price on his head, and he has lived underground, no one knows where he is, for the last 17 years. But Christianity, I'm not recommending these others. I'm talking about the climate we live in. Anybody who wants to take irresponsible potshots at the foundations of Christianity is free to do so. And in fact, the book then sells 10 million copies. We're recording this in order that those of you who care to know the historical reality behind the mythologies in these books try and get this straightened out for you. Let's talk for just a minute about the storyline of the book itself, just in case you haven't read it. The storyline is that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene. She was pregnant at the time of the crucifixion. She was whisked off to France. Her lineal descendants are still there. And that Jesus had this woman in the upper room, and Da Vinci was a part of the people of an underground clique of folk who remembered that Jesus was married and that they gave birth to a child, and that all kinds of people tried to write Gospels. Indeed, over 1,000 people tried to write, that maybe as many as 80 Gospels remained. Constantine came along in the 4th century, and he didn't like these Gospels about Jesus because he wanted a divine figure. So he managed to get together documents that would talk about Jesus as being divine and squash all the others. He then put together a combination between Roman paganism and the Christian faith, and this curious combination of the two was put together to help solidify his position, and this became Christianity as we now know it. That the Bible never had any authoritative text, and nobody knows what it really was. And Jesus was certainly human, but all this divinity stuff was a bunch of nonsense dreamed up by Constantine. And that Da Vinci was a part of this and knew this. Now, this shows up in the novel, but it's not just that this is the fabric of the novel. The novel is put up together so that two scholars, one from Oxford, the other from Harvard, in the very middle of the book, in about 4 pages, deliver what is positioned as a scholarly address to a young French policewoman in which all of this is set out as scientific fact. If the author had just written a novel with this storyline, I would not object. The reader is very badly deceived when this is set out as scholarly fact and claims are made at the beginning of the book that the basis of the novel is factual history. All right, now, this opens the question, how did we get our Gospels and what kind of material do we have in them? Jesus was a rabbi. He was so called by his contemporaries. Rabbis did not write down what they said. They gathered students. The students passed on the information in oral form. Thereby, it was protected from unauthorized ears. They preferred this style. It was their choice. The Babylonian Talmud of 36 volumes was not written down for a very long time, like hundreds of years. And the Mishnah, the earlier collection of the sayings of the Jewish rabbis, were in oral form for almost 400 years. Jesus, as a rabbi, functions in this same manner. The problem becomes, after some 30 years, and the people who heard it from Jesus could then pass it on to others, but the community that gathered around Jesus, namely the earliest Christian church, the church of the Jews who had believed in Jesus, they apparently decided this material is too precious for students of the rabbi. We want to hear it recited from the people who heard it from Jesus, but they're dying off. Other rabbis, okay, not this rabbi. So they began to authorize the writing down of this material, and this happens a generation after Jesus. It's in oral form for roughly that first 30 years. Luke is a companion of Paul. In the book of Acts, he says that he and Paul, we went here and we went here, we went here on Paul's last visit to Jerusalem. When Paul is arrested in Jerusalem, about the year 56 AD, suddenly Luke describes what happens to Paul, 2 years in prison. He did this and they did that. No, we. Paul insists that his case be tried by Rome, and then suddenly we got into the boat and we went here and we went there. So Luke is saying, indirectly, he was with Paul when he went back to Jerusalem. For 2 years, he had no access to him, but he knew what was going on. And then 2 years later, he managed to get permission to get into the same boat that Paul got into when he went to Rome. During those 2 years is the window of opportunity that Luke had to gather all of these stories about the sayings and events of the life of Jesus from the apostles and the other hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitnesses. He can check his references. He can put together a very, very well-documented document, which is the Gospel of Luke. And he says that he had eyewitnesses and that they gave him documents. If he is not faithful to those eyewitnesses, and if he is not faithful to the documents, the church is going to say, hey, he dreamed it up. We're not going to listen to this guy because he wrote most of that himself. He has people looking over his shoulder, namely the people who gave him the sources. Just like 25 years after the assassination of John Kennedy, you try and put together a book about John Kennedy, you can find tapes, you can find written documents, and you can talk to his friends. And when you get done, those people had jolly well better say he did a good job, because if they don't, then your work is going to be dead in the water. No one is going to be interested in it. But there is another form of oral tradition that's passed on in the Middle East. Other than just the rabbi teaching stuff to the student passes it on to other people. Every community, traditional community in the Middle East, has its own pool of stories that forms the unique history of that village. And usually these are not written down, usually because the people can't read and write. So the stories are remembered, and some of them are very, very old, and they are known to the community as the stories which form the identity of the community. So when they recite them, the community offers control. You tell it right, or someone in public will say, Ken, you don't have it right. This isn't the way it happened. And then it will be retold, and you will be publicly humiliated. You don't like being publicly humiliated, and so you tell it the right way. We have some of this in our country. We're not conscious of it, but we have some of it. If I recite to you a phrase out of a song, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the breeze. Now, if you are Anglo-Saxon tradition, you know that that's wrong. The right phrase is, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Nobody told you to sit down and memorize that. Nobody stood over you until you got it right. The whole community knows it, and if you say it wrong, you're going to be interrupted. That's the way oral tradition of famous rabbis was passed on, and particularly of the Rabbi Jesus, as we can presuppose. A friend of mine sent me recently a list of well-known proverbs in the English language, and some teacher in grade school had given half of them to their students, and the students were asked to fill in the second half. So some of them are as follows. Better be safe than punch a fifth grader. Strike while the bug is close. It's always darkest before daylight saving time. No news is impossible. Where there's smoke, there's pollution. Now, these kids are raised on television. They don't remember anything orally. We, of our generation, know a bit more, but in the past, they knew a great deal. As the case of our Middle Eastern world. I have a friend in Lebanon, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, professor of Arabic at the American University, who gathered the wisdom sayings and proverbs of just his one village, which was about 2,000 people, and he ended up with 2,448 proverbs, all of which the community knew orally, and he had two old women that he had his control. He checked with them if he heard any proverb anywhere to see if it was known in his village. If they didn't know it, he didn't write it down. They knew all 2,448. Our kids barely know a half a dozen. So not only does Luke have the rabbi has passed on material to his students, and not only do the early Jewish Christians of the world that Luke visited in the 50s sit around and say, when Jesus came to our village, he said X and Y, but also Luke himself affirms that he talked to the eyewitnesses and that he was given documents. All right, now we press on and we ask, well, now, what is the nature of the story as it is written up? It is not just the bare bones of what happened. Let's take an illustration. Supposing someone wants to talk about the death of John Kennedy, and someone says, a man in a car was shot by another man in a book depository office, warehouse. It's true, but this doesn't tell you the event. Somebody else says, the President of the United States was assassinated. Okay, now you know a bit more. You know who the man was, and you know that it was political, and you know that there was an assassination. Then a third person says, people all over the world looked into the abyss of evil and wept in the streets. That's all true. I can't prove it. I wasn't all over the world. I don't have documentary evidence that that's true. Now we are giving a layer of meaning to the text, which if you don't have that layer of meaning, the text with its bare bones is so bare it's almost an untruth. If all you can really say is one man shot another man in a passing car, you have not told the story of the death of John Kennedy. The Gospels are of the third type. They are event and interpretation of that event by means of adding meaning to it, as we just tried to do very briefly with John Kennedy. That's why Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aren't quite the same. That layer of meaning is a little different, because it comes through the vision of a different person in a different community for different readers. They are all thereby true, even though they are not always necessarily all precise. Now, Luke, of course, has to make a decision of faith, which he does, and it's on the basis of that decision of faith that he is pressed to get the record straight. As he says, for Theophilus, for whom he's writing, I'm going to tell you the truth about the events that have happened among us. He didn't just dream this up. The community would not have allowed him, because the people who gave him the information are in a position to correct when he gets done. All right, now Luke, I am convinced, writes his first edition, if you please, of his gospel in the mid-50s of the first century, 25 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Mark probably writes his gospel in the 70s. Luke may have written a second final version about 10 years later, as did Matthew, probably about that time. And probably the book of John is composed in about the year 90 of the first century. By the end of the first century, these four Gospels, the only four that come out of the apostolic community, that is the apostles and their friends, only produce these four. Those four are already, they're finished. They are translated into Greek. Maybe they were composed in Greek. They are finalized. The text is available to the church, and no one else can mess with it. Yes, some copyists made a few mistakes across the centuries, but 99.9% we have a text of the Gospels that's finalized before the end of the first century. Now, what happens in the second century? Middle of the second century, the Romans had had a third war with the Jews. They weren't popular. Along comes a fellow by the name of Marcion, and he says, yeah, well, we Greek Christians are really not too happy being linked with these Jews that aren't popular. But actually, he argued, the Old Testament is one God, the New Testament is another God. The old God is the God of justice and of creation, and the new God is the God of love. Jesus is the one who comes to bring us the new God. So he didn't like Matthew, too many quotes out of the Old Testament. Didn't like John, too many overtones of the Old Testament. Mark was too short. He took Luke, but he had to fiddle with it, because he couldn't tell you the story of the prodigal son, because the prodigal leaves the house, goes into the far country, and comes back to the same house. So no, he took that out. Then he took the letters of Paul, and he said, now these are the books that must be authoritative for us Christians. The rest of the church said, we don't like that. We're not going to cut ourselves off from the Old Testament. We're not at all pleased with the attempt to do this. And we don't like you taking your scissors and cutting out the bits and pieces that you don't like. And we're happy reading Matthew, Mark, and not John, and not just Luke. Aha. So if this fellow is going to put together his list of authoritative books, we'd better put together our list of authoritative books. They picked the four Gospels that were already authoritative. They added to them the writings of Paul. And so by the year about 170, we have lists of the books that the church considers authoritative, and it's 90% of the New Testament. There were a few books that they hadn't really decided on yet, and one was 2nd and 3rd John. They said nothing really important in it. 2nd Peter, they said it hasn't got the same style as 1st Peter. We don't know who wrote it. The book of Hebrews, we don't know who wrote that either. The book of Jude quotes some stuff from documents that aren't in the Bible. We're nervous about it. And the book of Revelation, we can't understand it. Those documents were sort of, we're not real sure what we're going to do with them. By the end of, late in the 2nd century, 90% of the New Testament is fixed, and the text is final, and the church persecuted, powerless. There's no big, powerful Vatican out there. There's no powerful Roman emperor who needs a document so that he can establish his power. They're in the catacombs, running for their lives, and these are the authoritative books for them. Another fellow came along, and he said, well, really, the spirit is good and the body is weak and evil. So if we're going to touch the things of God, there must be an emanation from the Spirit of God. And then that's another emanation. Another comes out of that. Finally, you get 7 of them, and sort of, one spirit coming out of another. Valentinius was this guy's name. By the time you get 7 of them, you're far enough away from pure spirit, which is God, and you can touch matter, and we can now have a revelation to human beings. Valentinius also influenced a lot of writings. So now what happened? As long as the Christians were Jews who had the Old Testament behind them, who knew that God had acted in history and had spoken to the prophets, they were able to hear the message of Jesus and understand it on a very deep level without any critical problems. But the minute you move out into the Greek world, now we have a people for whom truth is not something we discover from what God does in history. Truth is something you discover by thinking, ideas, being smart, becoming rational, your intuition, perhaps your religious experience, your perceptions. These are the things. It is out of the mind of the human being that truth comes. So here's somebody who says, or here is a group of texts which say God has acted in history in Jesus Christ. Well, they like the person of Jesus, but they're not quite sure they like the package. Because how can God act in history if history has to do with flesh and flesh is evil? No. God is pure spirit and has nothing to do with history. So they began creating other gospels, which reflect a combination of the person of Jesus, sometimes a few of his sayings, usually rather badly twisted, and a lot of their philosophical views. One of the earliest of these is called the Gospel of Thomas, maybe as early as 200, 150, we're not sure. And it is definitely Greek in nature. By this time, some Christians have decided to become monks off in the desert. And so the solitary, the person who lives completely alone, is the one that can really understand the kingdom. And within this, we're told that the one must become the many and the many must become the one, and all kinds of very strange sort of cryptic language. And you wonder who's the guru who's going to explain it. And in the middle of it, it tells us that God is in you and you are in God, and everything you need for your salvation is within you, and all you need to do is to deep within yourself, and you will be able to come up with what you need to be saved. We don't need Jesus now, except maybe someone to tell us to look within our own souls. It can be called the flight from history. You're getting away from God who acts in history to save, and you're back to, I will hold up a mirror and look within my own soul, and I will find all of the spiritual resources which I need. These false gospels, the church quickly looked at and said, this stuff is not for us. We have the 4 gospels that came out of the apostolic community in the first century, and they had 2 standards. One was, do the apostles approve them? Not necessarily that the apostles wrote them. Do they approve them? And second, have they affirmed their own power? Do people read them, and are they moved by what they read? Does something happen to them? Does the Spirit of God take this text and change people's lives? They came up with 4 gospels. The rest, they said, forget it. They didn't put everything on the table and dig through them. They had 4 from the first century. Then some stuff started showing up in the second century, even more in the third century, and they put them on the table and they threw away everything that they could find reason that were not authentic. The 4 gospels made it through that standard. All right, now, then the church, in the 7th century, was conquered by Islam. Islam came from the desert. They honored the prophet Jesus, but they found out about Jesus from the Christians who were living in the Byzantine world. And they read the Gospels and said, well, this isn't the Jesus we want. We want a Jesus who is just a prophet. There began to appear then within the Islamic Arabic writings, quote, sayings of Jesus. Sometimes there was a little hint of a tie to something in the Gospels, usually not. And now there are over 350 of these sayings, and they have been put together recently by a Muslim scholar in Cambridge, and he calls it the Muslim Jesus. He's very open. He says this was the vision of Jesus created by Muslim scholars and the Muslim community when they broke into the Middle East and interacted with these Christians. The figure of Jesus is picked up. Some of their own ideas about God and man and nature are added, and these are then set out in Muslim literature as being sayings of Jesus. All right, now these in the Da Vinci Code that we're talking about, one of the things that we're told is that these apocryphal gospels, these rejected gospels, were in fact the true gospels. No, they were late gospels, and they were rejected because they did not reflect the apostles and the community around Jesus. But in the novel, we're told that these documents elevated the female, and that Constantine wanted a gospel that put the female down. He wanted men to run everything. He's wrong on both counts. When you look at these documents, for example, this Gospel of Thomas that we mentioned, one of the statements reads, Simon Peter told them, "Let Mary go away from us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "Lo, I will lead her, that I may make her a male, that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself a male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, this doesn't sound to me like a document that elevates the female. It sounds like a document that puts the female down. The author of the novel has cherry-picked these documents to pick out little snippets that represent the storyline that he has created in his own imagination. They are not an authentic representation of what these documents are all about. In fact, many of them are very, very staunchly and bitterly and uncompromisingly anti-feminine. In the novel, the author, Brown, makes a big case out of this Gospel of Philip. And in the Gospel of Philip, there is a reference to the two scholars who are lecturing in the novel talk about the fact that, well, yes, in the Gospel of Philip, it talks about Mary Magdalene as a companion of Jesus, and the word companion, Aramaic, it means spouse, so it's really talking about Jesus having been married to Mary Magdalene. I happen to know and can read some Aramaic and have worked in this language for 30 years, not very good at it. I need a dictionary all the time, but I know some of it. And I do know that what the word companion is in the Aramaic language. It's the word khabir. And khabir means exactly that, friend or companion. The Pharisees formed clubs, and they called themselves the Chabura, the friends. Now, they're not describing the fact that they're all married to one another. It is the common word for a friend or a companion. The Greek word that shows up in the Gospel of Thomas is the word koinonia, which is the word we use for the fellowship of the Holy Spirit. We're not talking about the Holy Spirit being married when we use that kind of language. And then in this text, which the novel quotes from the Gospel of Philip, there is a little text which has got a lot of holes in it. That is, the one copy we have, which is the 6th century, probably written in the 3rd century, Christian century. The holes have bits and pieces missing. The proper edition puts the bits and pieces missing in brackets, and then the translator sometimes writes in a few words. Maybe these were the words, although we don't know. The critical parts for the argument of the story are the parts that are missing, such as the phrases that have been added, and you, the reader, don't know this, are, "But Jesus loved all, often, her mouth, the disciples were offended, they expressed disapproval." All of those are not in the text which has remained from this Gospel of Philip. And also, the text supposedly, we're told that Jesus kept kissing his wife in public and the disciples got upset. In Middle Eastern world, men and women do not kiss each other in public. Women will kiss women and men will kiss men, but men and women will not do it. This is considered a private act, and it is not to be done even with your own wife in public. I lived there 45 years, and I never saw a man and a woman anywhere ever kiss each other in public. Go through the Bible. You will find the word kiss occurs 37 times. Yes, it occurs 40 times. 37 times has to do with a kiss of greeting, usually almost always a man kissing a man. Once it's a case of a harlot kissing a customer, and twice is in the Song of Songs, where the bride dreams about kissing her groom-to-be. She doesn't actually kiss him, she just dreams about kissing him. But the idea that Jesus, in public, before his disciples, keeps kissing his wife and getting them upset is maybe a very fit Greek culture, but it does not fit Middle Eastern culture at all. Furthermore, if Jesus were married, I personally have no objection. Jeremiah the prophet was not married. Isaiah the prophet was married. And nobody imagined that the effectiveness of their prophethood was tied to whether they were married or not. His being the Son of God and being God's presence among us has nothing to do with whether he is or is not married. But if he had been married, they would have recorded it. Why? Particularly for the Greek world. Because the Greek world assumed that the gods up on Mount Olympus had girlfriends all over the place. It's easier to present Jesus as divine if he's married than present him divine if he's not married. The real clincher is in the first chapter of Corinthians, where Paul is arguing and saying, I have the same rights as the other apostles. For example, he says, I have the right to be accompanied by a wife like Peter and Barnabas and the other apostles. If Jesus had been married, he would have said, I have the right to be married and be accompanied by my wife like Jesus and like Peter and like Barnabas and the apostles. The beginning of his list would have been the person of Jesus. If Jesus had been married, it is impossible to imagine that Paul didn't know it, and he certainly would have mentioned it. And in this same document that supposedly tells us that Jesus was married, and thereby the novel tells us this is a document that lifts up the feminine, one chapter later, Gospel of Philip, we read as follows. When Eve was still in Adam, death did not exist. But when she was separated from him, death came into being. If he again becomes complete and attains his former self, death will be no more. Now, I know of no place in all of religious and non-religious literature where you have this kind of a put-down on women. And to imagine that these Gnostic Gospels are something that elevated the women and that the church chose not to do so is completely ridiculous. All right, we go on and try to look and see what is happening in this lecture, which supposedly these two scholars deliver to this young policewoman. Novelists can do whatever they like with history. My objection is that this is set up as a scholarly debate trying to convince you, the reader, that it is in fact a scholarly discussion. Teabing, the American scholar, says, the Bible did not come down as a fax from heaven. This is true. My Muslim friends, through their history, have affirmed that this is the way the Quran came to the Muslim community. It was eternal in the mind of God. It was then given a little bit at a time to the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel then recited it one chapter at a time to Muhammad, who memorized it. Finally, it's written down. So, indirect fax, if you please, through the angel Gabriel, but nevertheless, a fax that comes down out of heaven for the people. Never in Christian history has any serious thinker ever imagined that this is the way we as Christians understand the Gospels. In the early centuries, there was a dictation theory that maybe an angel did some dictating to some of the Gospel writers. But for the last, let's say, 1,000 years, no one has talked this way. What happens is that God inspires the author of the text, and God's Spirit moves through the personality and history and knowledge of that person living in a community. And so the end result is what is miraculously of God. Think, if you will, standing at Niagara Falls. You're not really interested whether or not this water came from Lake Superior or this little bit of water came with tracer elements in it from Lake Erie, or whether this is from Lake Michigan. You're standing there looking at the final result, which is the magnificent and oppressive Niagara Falls. The Gospels are the Niagara Falls. There are various people and communities that have participated in the production. Who are the people who remembered the sayings of Jesus? Who are those who passed them on? Who are the eyewitnesses to whom Luke talked? Who translated this stuff out of Aramaic into Greek? Were there small collections of them put together that were given to Luke as documents? He says there were. How many people were involved in doing that? We're talking about a process that comes from the Spirit of God through this community. Finally, it comes over the waterfall at Niagara, and you stand there, and the world has never been the same since. The Gospels are now in our hands. They are of God through people in history. Remember all three of them. They are of God. They are through people. They are in history. All right, now we go on in our novel, and Tebing, this American scholar, says, man created the Bible, and it has evolved through countless translations, editions, and versions. History has never had a definitive version of the Bible. Now, this sounds like somebody totally misinformed trying to give a talk. The word version is a weasel word. When Christian scholars use this word, they're using it to mean a translation, the King James Version of the Bible, a translation. Now, there's only one text of the New Testament, and that's in Greek. Here it is. This gets translated into Syriac, it gets translated into Latin, it gets translated into Coptic, it gets translated into English, it gets translated into French. We now have more than 1,000 translations. 1,000 translations doesn't mean that there are different texts. There's one text. It is in Greek. It is the authoritative text. And don't confuse the word version as though it were a whole bunch of different texts. There are Muslim scholars who think that our Bible is a whole bunch of different texts. That's what the reader of this novel is led indirectly to believe. Yes, we do not have a definitive translation. As the language changes, we will always want the translation to change with it. We do have a definitive text. The definitive text of the Gospels was finalized before the end of the first century. And we have more evidence for the authenticity of the Greek text of the New Testament than any other hand-copied document of antiquity. The novel goes on to tell us more than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, and yet only a relative few were chosen for inclusion. This is completely misleading. It wasn't a matter of 80 people were asked to write for a contest, and then we get all 80 of them, and we sit and look at these 80, and we pick 4 winners. That's not it at all. The apostolic community of the first century, the people around Jesus and those who knew him, produced 4. The church immediately says, this is great and this is for us. Later on, century after century after century, other stuff is written, and it's pretty easy for the church to say, yeah, well, these people have got good imagination and it may fit their ideas, but it doesn't fit the Jesus of history who founded the faith in which we believe. This is not the Jewish rabbi who walked around the dusty streets at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. All right, then also we're told in this novel that Constantine was the person who made the selection. There is no recognized scholar anywhere in the world who's going to stand up and say that this is true. It is simply not true. Constantine had absolutely nothing to do with this process. By the end of the first century, the Gospels were pretty much fixed as authoritative in the church. By the end of the second century, the letters of Paul and the book of Acts were definitely authoritative for everybody. And it wasn't until after Constantine was dead that the final decision was made about these documents about which they were a little bit nervous. Finally, they decided these do speak to God's people and have across the centuries, we will include them. Constantine had nothing to do with it. Then we're told also, Tebing, the American scholar, says the fundamental irony of Christianity, the Bible as we know it today, was collated by the pagan Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. I'm not going to examine or try to cross-examine the psyche of Constantine. He did remain the high priest of Roman paganism. He did confess the Christian faith and was baptized before he died. The Christian faith was useful to him in the Roman Empire, trying to use it as glue, but one should not overdo that because there were divisions in the church and he did not force all those people to come together. Try this out for size. Supposing somebody says, we never had a definitive text of the Constitution of America until George Bush put it together. Now, in the year 2004, George Bush selects the parts of the Constitution that he feels appropriate, and he does it in order to solidify the power of the Republican Party and get himself reelected. This is outrageous. This document has been around for more than 200 years, and George Bush had absolutely nothing to do with the wording that is in it. The same is true with Constantine and with the Gospels. The novel goes on. We're told Constantine created a hybrid religion acceptable to paganism and to the church. If that's true, then Christianity is this combination of paganism and what the Christian church believed before that. But what about the Armenians, who were already a Christian nation before Constantine? Their faith is the same as ours. But if the Christian faith is this combination of the church and the paganism of Rome, then the Christian faith of the Armenians would be very different. So would the Christian faith of the Syriac church and of the Coptic church. These were large Christian communities that had coalesced together in their own language with their own culture. They have the same New Testament and they have basically the same faith. So the idea that this is some combination that Constantine put together is completely ridiculous. And also, we can note the fact that the church throughout its history has always found points of relationship, if you please, or contact or communication with the outside world. Here were these Jews who had believed in Jesus. They want to take the sayings of Jesus and put it into Greek for the Greeks to read. They decided, we can't ask these Greeks to worship Elohim or Yahweh or Adonai. These are the Hebrew words for God in the Old Testament. We're going to have to use Greek words. They picked the word theos, and that's the word for God in the New Testament, in the Greek New Testament. But the word theos is the word the Greeks used for Zeus. It was a pagan word, but it was the general word, the highest word they had for God. The church took the risk of building the bridge into the mind of the Greek world by using the word for God that they already had. They were very careful that the traffic flowed from the gospel into the Greek mind and not the Greek mind back into the gospel. This has always happened. It will always happen in history because the only way any of us can learn anything is by means of things that we already know. The novel accuses the Christian faith of being a mix of paganism and Christianity because this is what they did. The deity of Jesus shows up already. Julian the Apostate. Sorry, we'll talk about the deity of Jesus in a minute. Julian came some 50 years after Constantine, was a nephew of Constantine. He didn't like Christianity. So he decided we're going to return the Roman Empire back to paganism. Just a minute. If Constantine had made a marriage between the Christian church and the pagan Roman Empire that was acceptable to both parties, then why does any pagan want to overthrow this combination if paganism is happy with it? Both sides would have said, we're okay with this. Julian the Apostate came along and said, we are going to restore Roman paganism because it has been thrown out. The very fact that he came along is evidence that the storyline of our novel is mythology and not history. We're also told funny little things that Constantine changed the Sabbath, the day of rest, from Saturday to Sunday. No, that already shows up in the book of Acts. What Constantine did was, he said, the laws which protect the rights of pagans to have a day off on their feast days must also apply to Christians on Sunday because that's the day, that's their feast day for them to worship their God. Very different from what we're told in the novel. Then we're told in the novel, quote, Jesus as Son of God was proposed and voted on at the Council of Nicea. This is true, but it was not a matter of, is Jesus the Son of God or isn't he? The question was, when we write this creed that we are all probably going to agree on, shall we call Jesus the Word of God, or should we call him the Son of God? The two, in their minds, meaning basically the same thing. They did take a vote, and they did decide to choose Son of God. But the question, is Jesus the divine presence on earth among us, was not up for grabs, and it was not up for discussion. We are again deceived by this conversation in the middle of the novel. The power of the Vatican was not at stake. The Bishop of Rome did not even attend. He was not in good health. He sent a couple of presbyters to attend because he didn't think it was that important. And who is the person of Jesus is not something dreamed up in the 4th century. It is affirmed by the New Testament and in the early writings of Paul, particularly the 2nd chapter of Philippians and the 1st chapter of Colossians, in which Jesus is affirmed as coming from God and who emptied himself of his divine prerogative, taking upon himself the form of a servant. And the highest affirmation of the deity of Jesus is already there in the writings of Paul in the 50s of the 1st century. We don't have to wait for the Council of Nicea in the 4th century to introduce this idea. Yes, there was a man by the name of Arius who was there. He was roundly defeated in his resolutions. He said, okay, Jesus is divine, fine, but he is of a different substance from the Father. He's a lower quality of divinity. And the council said, no, he's of the same quality. Then Arius said, well, all right, Jesus is very important. He is the firstborn of all creation. In the Old Testament, that phrase means in authority over all creation. But Arius took it to mean something else. He said, aha, Jesus is created. God creates Jesus, then through Jesus he creates the world. And the council said no. Jesus is the Word of God that is among us, and the Word of God and the mind of God is not a part of the created world. The body of Jesus is created, but the divine Jesus that dwells in that body is eternal in the mind of God, and it is uncreated. Arius was there. It was a big debate. He lost roundly, but is Jesus divine was not a part of the debate. All right, back to the novel, which says, many scholars claim that the early church literally stole Jesus from his original followers, hijacking his human message, shrouding it in an impenetrable cloak of divinity, and using it to expand their own power. I've written several books on the topic, says Tübingen. Yes, there are among us in the Western world critical scholars who think that they can take a set of scissors and they can cut the Gospels, particularly the first 3 synoptic Gospels, up into pieces and decide that this is late and is manufactured, and this may have been manufactured, and maybe this is really from Jesus. And then they get a little collection of stuff that they're ready to affirm that is from Jesus, and they say, aha, this is the real Jesus, whom they call the historical Jesus. Well, this pair of scissors is going to cut on the basis of who is holding the scissors and who accepts that this is a legitimate methodology. You're not going to come out with a scientific conclusion. You're going to come out with a conclusion that supports the ideas of the people who are in the room doing the cutting. Yes, there are some very intelligent people who come up with this inclusion, and they represent about 0.5% of contemporary international English language scholarship. There are about 40 of them, and there are about 8,000 of us who are members of the large professional societies for the study of the New Testament working in the English language around the world. Everybody has the right to their view. I respect this opinion, but it is not the considered opinion of the scholars of the world. It is the considered opinion of this very narrow slice that is in the extreme left of New Testament scholarship. In fact, my Muslim friends hold a view somewhat like this. They are convinced that the Gospels are corrupted and of no use, and thereby you should turn to the Quran. The Quran is the pure word of God. The Gospels give you an impure word because the disciples of Jesus did not remember what he said in an accurate fashion. For the last 1,000 years, we have been debating with Islam or gently pointing out to them that their criticism of the New Testament we feel is not adequate. In fact, my friends on the extreme left are not representing the Christian faith. Most of them have already left the Christian faith. They are trying to set a foundation for a new religion, and that is their privilege if they so choose to do. Then we're told Constantine shaped the face of Christianity as we know it today. No, Constantine created Christendom. That is, Constantine took the Christian faith and he made it the foundation of Byzantine civilization. The Armenians had done this, so it was not a new idea. But Constantine, for the Western world, set up we have the Christian faith as the foundation of our civilization, a foundation that is crumbling in the secularism of the 20th century, but for more than 1,000 years, the Christian faith was the fabric of Western society, and that does come from Constantine. This does not come from the Christian faith itself. It comes to what Constantine did with it in terms of the structure of society and the structure of the politics of his day. The travesty continues. We're told that some of these hidden gospels that are going to tell us the real truth about Jesus were among the Dead Sea Scrolls. No, the Dead Sea Scrolls are Jewish documents, and there isn't the slightest scrap of anything about Jesus in any of them. We're told that the Nag Hammadi documents, discovered in 1948, present to us Jesus in very human terms. In fact, the opposite is true. When you look at the Gospels, you find that Jesus gets tired, he weeps, he eats, he sleeps, he suffers, he cries out, he dies. You don't find this kind of stuff in these synoptic Gospels at all. Here we're getting the mystical Jesus, who through the emanations of his mind tells you that God is within you and you are within God, and the many must become the one and the one must become many, and you're looking for the guru who's going to unlock it. There is no human Jesus shows up in these documents. In the Gospels, we have the human Jesus and the fact that God is acting in history through the one who is the Word become flesh. We're told that these Gnostic documents worship the divine and that the Bible is anti-feminist. When you look at I'm quite ready to admit that a long time in Christian history, we have not chosen to allow ourselves to see the position of leadership that women had in the New Testament church. There are women elders. There is a woman apostle in the 7th verse of 16th chapter of Romans. There are women deacons. There are women professors of theology. And women of high standing are attracted to the preaching of Paul. If Paul had put them down, they were women of high standing. They would not have been attracted to what he had to say if he told them to shut up and sit down. Every layer of leadership that the first century church had, there is a record of some women that appear by name in those, most of them by name. The Old, God is neither male nor female. God is a spirit. The Old and the New Testament use both male and female language to enrich our understanding of God. For example, in the New Testament, we are told that the believer is born of God, that we must experience the new birth. That's in the Gospel of John. In John's first letter, he uses the phrase, the believer must be born of God. All right, so God acts like a female and gives birth to the believers. Here you have rich metaphorical language that is definitely feminine in nature, and it is used to enrich our understanding of God, who is neither male nor female. Jesus likens himself to a good woman and to a good shepherd, male and female. Jesus likens himself to a mother hen, and Paul likens himself to a nurse, and he says, I am in travail, like a woman giving birth, until Christ is born in you. The New Testament is not frightened of this female language, in fact uses it without reserve and uses it without apology, because male and female are being brought together in a new balance and a new equality that had been lost for many centuries before that. When we look at the ancient documents, we know that they were handwritten. And so anybody can go to a copyist and can ask them to copy anything they want. The church is not in a position to control what is copied and what is passed on. And so many documents that the church did not approve of were out there, and there were people who liked them and passed them on. The church was very careful about the documents it selected and was very careful about their authenticity. The entire novel in question is built around the supposition that these rejected documents, if they appeared, would cause the collapse of Christianity. Now, they've been on my desk all my working professional life. They've been published, most of them, since 1905, and one's found since then. They make 2 volumes. They're out in 2 volumes there. They're about this thick. And Catholic scholarship has participated in studying these. And I have read articles by Catholic scholars. The idea that the Vatican is terrified lest these appear, and if they do appear, the Christian faith is going to collapse. This is ridiculous. The material has been published. It's out. You can get a set. They're called the Apocryphal New Testament. They're kind of dull reading because they're kind of dull and rather poor quality. When Raymond Brown, the very able Roman Catholic New Testament scholar, reviewed a sort of summary of these Gnostic Gospels, his idea was, this is the flots, he said in his review, this is the flotsam and the rubbish of the 2nd to the 4th centuries. What we're dealing with is nothing that threatens us in those documents. In the documents that have been brought together to form the New Testament, we have authenticity, and we have documents that have moved the world, that in the last 100 years to 150 years, there are a fresh 1.3 billion new Christians in Africa and Asia and South America, saints and martyrs who copied and preserved this material, lived and died by these documents. Indeed, the Bible is an anvil that has broken many hammers. It is also a gift of God that today inspires 2.5 billion people across the planet who proudly call themselves Christian. And we can be grateful to all the rich heritage that is given to us in Christ in these earth-shaking and earth-moving documents. Thank you.